My son's therapist has been giving him some strange tasks. His latest assignment was deadly. My son would spend around an hour each day talking to his therapist through an online Zoom call. He'd do this in his room with the door closed, so I could never really hear what the conversation entailed. I thought it was slightly weird how often they'd talk to each other, but if it was helping my son with his depressive thoughts, that's all that mattered. I just wish I realized sooner what was really happening. Although I couldn't hear what was being said in his room, I did walk in on my son multiple times while he was in the middle of doing his therapy homework. At first, his assignments were simple. Read a section of the Bible, memorize this prayer, practice breathing, etc. We're a very religious family, so I made sure to get him a Christian therapist. I noticed he was very good at incorporating these duties into his routine, and they seemed to bring him pleasure. However, that only lasted a few days, as his tasks became more and more strange. It started when I came home late from work and passed my son's room on the way to bed. I decided to peek in to make sure he was asleep, and I quickly saw he wasn't. Instead, he was kneeling at his bedside, praying. I asked him what he was doing up so late, and he explained that he had been reciting prayers for the last 2 hours. As my eyes glanced around his room, I noticed he had stapled several sketches of various types of symbols around his room, some of which I'd never seen before. There were so many you almost couldn't see his walls. He told me that all of this was an order from his therapist. He said if he didn't do as instructed, the bad thoughts would eat at his brain. I felt a bit uneasy, but he assured me that it was all right and that he was fine. I decided to brush it off. At least he was trying, right? The second time I caught him performing a task, it was much more than just praying. He was exiting the bathroom, tightly wrapped up in a towel, shivering. His fingers, face, and toes were inflamed and discolored. He was shivering violently as he tried to sneak by without being seen. When I confronted him about his near-to-frostbite state, he simply said it would rid himself of the demon inside him. When I asked where he'd gotten such an idea, he replied through jitters, "The therapist, Mom. I need to do this. It's the only way." When I urged him to be more careful and that it was clear this was clearly injuring him, all he could say was, "I know, but I'll do what it takes to not feel this way anymore." My hopes of my son overcoming his depression almost disappeared as his behavior only worsened. Praying for hours each night caused him to get little to no sleep, meaning he could barely stay awake and function throughout the day. He'd experience hallucinations and paranoia, all while blindly completing his assignments. I tried talking him into considering different options, but he was optimistic that it was working, insisting that I wait it out and see. I informed him that I would send an email to the therapist, asking to lessen the intensity of his homework, but my son was afraid that the treatment would end up being ineffective if done so. Trusting in the Lord and the church, I decided to give the therapist one last chance. The final task, however, was the worst of them all. Saying it was a dangerous, cruel idea would have been an understatement. It was a weekend afternoon when I heard a loud thumping noise coming from upstairs. At first, I thought it was just my son stapling up more of those weird symbols, but when the thuds were accompanied by sharp cries, I knew it was something much worse. I opened my son's door. Nothing could have prepared me for what I saw next. My son's left arm was nailed to the wall. Nails protruded out of his now blackened purple skin, dripping blood as he limply held a hammer in his right. He was completely out of it. The adrenaline, dissociation, and lack of sleep made it so he could only pitifully whimper as he stared at the bent spikes sticking out of his arms. I can't remember much else, other than the fact that I stood frozen, screaming. According to my son, this was the final task. If he wanted to cure his depression, he'd have to nail himself to the wall in the shape of a holy cross. He'd then bleed out until the evil within fully left his body, at which point his blood would no longer gush out of him, and he'd be saved. This assignment was more than physically impossible, but deadly. My son was anemic, meaning that the blood loss this would have caused would have been fatal. If he'd gone through with it, he would have died. When I returned to the church leader that I'd hired the therapist from complaining about how disgusting a therapist we'd been assigned, I was met with a confused look. Apparently, we'd never been assigned a therapist, and my son was still on the waiting list. I gave him the name of the therapist, but was told it wasn't on any of their records. Even my confirmation email was deleted. It was as if the therapist never even existed. I don't know what it was this person wanted from my son, but I know for a fact it wasn't to help him overcome his depression. I'm relieved to think that the therapist is gone for good, though I'm starting to become worried again. As to this day, I can still hear my son praying those same prayers long into the night.